So, hello everybody. Um, my name's Stephen Haven. I'm a senior data science consultant at the Energy Systems Catapult. I'm happy you're all joined today for our talk. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get underway. We'll be recording this session, so you're aware. This will be then put on our YouTube page, but it'll also be put on the advice webpage as well, so you're aware. Please keep your microphones and cameras off so that we can focus on the speakers, myself and Alex. And please feel free to use the chat and put all your comments and questions and links and everything in there as well. Alex, please, can you go to the next slide? So I just wanted to do a very quick introduction about what we'll be talking about today. I'm not Alex Bookman. Dr. Alex Bookman is also on the screen. He'll be giving the main bulk of the talk today. But that will be all about how we can maybe look at how AI can be applied for flexibility to help decarbonize our energy networks. This is part of a wider program called the AI for Decarbonization's Virtual Center for Excellence. So what I'm going to be doing is just give a quick introduction, and then we'll leave it to Alex to give you sort of a wider overview. So go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so I'll do the quick introduction, and then we've got sort of three core sections. They're going to focus on different areas. The first part is going to be on just an introduction to energy system flexibility and its importance. The second part is going to be a deep dive into a key challenge in flexibility. And then the third part will be looking at sort of some emerging and unsolved challenges. And for each part of those, we'll allow also question and answer. So if anyone has questions for each part of those, please put them in the chat and we'll get to them. Next slide, please. If everyone could turn off their cameras, please, that would help us focus on the speakers for the remainder of the presentation. Yeah, as I mentioned, this will be part of the advice program, which is a DESNZ project. The Department for Energy Security and Net Zero are funding this project, and that's run by ourselves, the Energy Systems Catapult, Digital Catapult, and the Alan Turing Institute. And the core aims of this program really is to help sort of coordinate collaboration across the core sectors we're looking at to help engagement. And we're also helping to define some key decarbonization challenges where AI can help make some real inroads. We're focusing on four main areas: energy, built environment, manufacturing, and agriculture. And this is really the first webinar in the series we have. So we will have quite a few throughout the year, and I hope you can join us for them too. We've already had a launch in December, so I'll share a link. I think there'll be some links shared in the chat. But we've now also got an ecosystem landscape report that was just released, which looks at sort of how AI is being applied for decarbonisation across the UK. And also we've released a report on key decarbonisation challenges that we identified. And that's really what this webinar is focused on, one of those challenges. So next slide, please. I just wanted to briefly talk about sort of the areas that we've been looking at, the broad landscape. We're not very interested in AI if it has very little decarbonisation impact, so we've sort of not focused on any of those areas. We've also then collected all these sort of obvious areas where AI can be applied, and that's obviously areas where there's a lot of data, where there's been a lot of research. We wanted to make sure we captured those. But a lot of our work has been on the sort of third category there on the right, which is maybe more systematic blockers to decarbonisation, which perhaps have been overlooked in the research or in the innovation landscape. So that could be looking at things like where AI could help with skills development in the area, whether that's installing heat pumps or charging points, but maybe also looking at negative perceptions and how AI can support in those areas. Next slide, please. So as you'll find in the report, we've sort of identified 7 sort of grand key areas, which will be forming topics of our webinars throughout. I think someone's got their microphone on. If they could just mute themselves, getting some background noise. This talk will obviously be about Grand Challenge 3, which is about maximizing flexibility in energy networks, but the other areas will be covered in future webinars. But if you want to read in a bit more detail, then please check out the reports we're going to be sharing links to later. Next slide, please. The final thing I really want to talk about here was about some specific sort of well-defined challenges we've also identified. So we've created sort of these cards, and there's virtual challenge cards if you want to follow the QR code there. These link to, and I think it's in the chat as well. These are very key challenges where we think AI can make some real inroads in all those 4 sectors we mentioned before. They have lots of other information on them as well, where in terms of what we think their impact could be on decarbonisation, how suitable AI is for solving those problems, but also a bit about the novelty as well. So we're really keen for challenges which haven't been attacked before, to be, or not attacked in detail, to really be utilized to help decarbonisation here. So I think the next slide is now the move on to the main part. So I'm going to do a quick introduction of Alex. I've got a little of a bio here, and then we'll get on with our first section. So Alex Buckman is our Energy Systems Catapult's Innovation Solutions Architect for Flexibility, and he leads on our strategy for enabling a flexible net zero energy system by 2050. He's a PhD in mechanical engineering, and he's spent the last 8 years developing whole energy systems approaches to understand and enable flexibility across a range of skills and applications. So I'm very pleased to introduce Alex now, who will give us a nice introduction to energy systems flexibility. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. Hi, everyone. So what we're really going to start off at the basic level, really, as the introduction to flexibility, and then we're going to build it up. So ultimately, the energy system flexibility is the ability to match the demands of our energy system with the supply. So as demand changes, so does the supply of energy that needs to be delivered, and that's how we've done it traditionally for quite a long time. And so without reliable flexibility, what happens is that you don't get the energy that you need for your demands, and so that's when you start to suffer your blackouts, and then you can have damage to equipment on the network, and ultimately can lead to potential risks to life. So flexibility within our energy system is critical, and we're at a really critical time for it as well, as I'll continue to talk about as we go on. So in between your supply and demand, you've got the pipes and the wires, and loads of other fairly expensive infrastructure that is in between those. And so that's the way that we typically transmit energy from your supply to your demand. And so it importantly has to meet the most extraordinary circumstances. So when we specify how big your pipes and wires need to be, they need to be sized for those 1 in 20 style winters. So those winters that are extraordinary compared to other winters. And that's really important, because that is quite an expensive criteria to meet when you're talking about quite big infrastructure in some places. So historically, within the UK, we've had a really resilient energy system. So where we control a fairly small number of suppliers, energy suppliers, and essentially turn on and off different power stations, and they are typically burning different types of fossil fuels in different ways, or potentially we might import more gas. And to help with balancing, we use storage. But the storage is not typically the same that's transmitted. So you might be transmitting electricity, but you're storing gas, and then you're going to burn that gas in a power station to produce electricity to support you when you need it. So now, to balance the energy system, which has multiple energy vectors, we need multiple networks and multiple types of storage. So when I say energy vector, I mean, right, you've got electricity, you've got gas, you potentially in the future might have hydrogen, you potentially might have district heating, and so all of these interplay with each other. And then you've got all the different types of storage at different parts of the network too. So, and then you've got to consider the interactions with other countries, so via interconnectors, and so you might be importing various different ways of storing energy. So be it gas, or I don't know, you could even store things like biomass and things like that, importing into your country at different times. And then you've got the storage that is focused at different parts of the network. So you can start to see how this problem is getting more and more kind of tricky to reconcile, and that's even quite hard to do at the moment with relatively few kind of actors on the supply side. Now, it's important to note that electricity is the most difficult to balance. It's the one that needs to be balanced in real time. So whilst gas and heat networks have some kind of inertia with them, so if you kind of turn down the amount of heat that you're putting into your hot water in a heat network, that won't immediately result in kind of changes in your heating within kind of radiators and things like that within a district heat network. But whereas with electricity, it's kind of almost instantaneous across the entire system. So it's quite a difficult network to balance. And so a lot of the focus, when you talk about flexibility, a lot of the focus is really trying to balance our electricity system, whilst also making best use of the kind of the features and the characteristics of those other kind of energy systems that we have. But it's going to become harder to balance the system in the future. And so a couple of reasons. One is that our ability to flex supply is diminishing a little bit. So fossil fuels are great kind of ways to store energy, and in the future we are not going to be able to use fossil fuels in the same way that we have done kind of up until now. And at the same time, our demand side flexibility is going to be higher, but that's largely because we're going to be kind of having quite a bit of electrification. So when we talk about electricity being the hardest to balance, that's going to become a little bit harder to do, because we're going to have a lot more kind of electrification on the system. So what I'm going to talk through over the next kind of slides, it's a bit more details about the characteristics of flexibility, how we can really think about the big picture of what flexibility means, and then we'll kind of dig into why it's going to become harder to balance, and then look at in the deep dives and the overviews how artificial intelligence might be able to help in some of those challenges. So ultimately, flexibility operates over varying timescales. When we talk about flexibility, it's always good to clarify what timescale we're talking about, because all of it needs to be balanced. It varies over years, it varies over months, it varies over days, it varies over seconds. And all of those, when you think about which technologies we're going to use for what, it all plays into each other. And so if we look over the course of a year, this is kind of a few years old data, but it's still relevant. This is our daily gas supply in 2019. And so what we can really see is that during those winter months, we use substantially more gas than in the summer months, which is pretty obvious to when you think about it, that gas provides most of our heating in the UK. But what you can see here is that how do we actually kind of get that gas into our system during those winter months? And that is through interconnectors, through liquid natural gas imports, and through withdrawing from our storage. Now, we used to have a lot more storage in the UK for gas than we do now. But we do rely a lot on our kind of interconnectors with other countries. So then, and just a little stat, like in kind of 2019, the difference in gas energy consumed between the coldest and the warmest 6 months was 192 terawatt hours, and that is a heck of a lot of a difference. And so when you start thinking, right, if we can't have our gas for our gas boilers, we've got to replace that with electricity. Therefore, the big questions are, how are we going to create enough capacity for that electricity supply within those winter months when we can't necessarily rely on the import of fossil fuels? So then going down from a year down to kind of a week by week, day by day kind of time scale. This data is from 2018, but in particular, it's a particular week in 2018, which was the beast from the east. So this was, most of you will probably remember it, but it's a particularly cold spell in the UK where kind of lots of extreme things were happening, including, for example, in that week, we kind of cut off gas supply to some manufacturers and kind of large industrial users out of kind of necessity for preserving, or effectively preserving life, because you're kind of providing gas to domestic properties. So the graph on the right shows that within 3 hours, our heating demand grew by around about 116 gigawatts in terms of gas. So when you do a couple of kind of basic assumptions on kind of performance of heat pumps and kind of efficiency of gas boilers, that's roughly 8 Hinkley Point C nuclear power plants coming online within 3 hours. It's a huge amount, and then that's on top of 10 gigawatts of electricity demand swing, and so that's three Hinkley Point Cs roughly. And so you're talking about a huge amount of kind of demand growth within just a 3-hour period, and that's really exemplifying how big a challenge this is in terms of that kind of hours, days, weeks flexibility. And on the left, you can see the chart for that week that provides, okay, how did we deal in that beast from the east? How did we deal with the flexibility challenge there? Where did we get it from? And what that really shows us is that during those extreme conditions, we relied heavily on our fossil fuels. So roughly 80% of our flexibility in that week was provided by fossil fuels. And so forecasts, kind of, so weather and demand and also a system called the balancing mechanism are the key tools that our energy system operator has to kind of really kind of help balance these kind of timescales. And on this one, at the moment, kind of thousands of trades, so kind of transactions between suppliers and kind of flexibility providers are issued daily. But then take it down to a second by second. So within our electricity network, we've got to maintain our frequency within our power system. So what we have is a target, and we have a kind of a limit in terms of what our range could be. And if you go outside that limit for a kind of a period of time, then it can start having quite big issues on the machinery that's operating on the network. And so what we really see is that, say, when an event happens, so when kind of a large plant trips or something, what you see is a change in your frequency level. And what we've got to do is balance that. We've got to take some action to balance that out. And so what the energy system operator does is procure various services from various different flexibility assets to essentially come onto the system at quite short notice and last for varying amounts of time to provide different services. So the really fast acting stuff is kind of trying to contain the problem, trying to really kind of reduce its impact. Then you've got moderation, and then you've got replacement. So you start to try and build that back up to that kind of that normal kind of target frequency. And so this is happening kind of all the time. Kind of we're having these kind of balancing actions that are being taken all the time. And it's really important to do really reliably. As we kind of our energy systems kind of changing, these services are changing, and if you look on the energy system operator website, you'll see that there's a range of different services that they provide around flexibility, and there's lots of information on there if you wanted to have a look at them. But that's just kind of a characteristic of what it looks like. So what we've shown so far is that kind of your flexibility is kind of happening between kind of your yearly stuff, your weekly, daily, kind of monthly stuff, but also on a second by second basis. And so there's lots of different kind of technologies that participate within different parts of that system, but also some that kind of straddle the boundary between different parts as well. So to make it a little bit more kind of difficult for us, flexibility also kind of in the future is really important kind of in terms of space as well. And so just to kind of emphasize why this is the case. So just a little bit of information for those of you that don't know. We have transmission, we have distribution networks. So transmission is really about getting your kind of electricity and your energy from kind of your big suppliers all the way down to your demands. And so that's a kind of very high voltage levels, and then you go to a substation, which is what these things are representing, and their voltage gets kind of changed to lower and lower voltage until it gets to your home. And so what we're seeing here are some kind of maps that SPEN produce. So SPEN are one of the network operators, and kind of they operate both in Scotland but also in the Cheshire and Warrington area, kind of around kind of northwest England. What they've actually got a really kind of unique set of monitoring on their network. So every single kind of low voltage substation in their areas monitored, which isn't the usual practice at the moment. But what it gives us kind of what it allows us to see is really the variability in how kind of close to meeting headroom capacity of kind of a network of different assets are. So what this means is that effectively the value that your flexibility is providing, so trying to kind of reduce the amount of demand at a given time, varies across different spaces, different parts of the network. And you'll see that all those kind of those green blobs on the left in the low voltage network, they're ones where we can allow a bit of electrification. We can allow, so as more electric vehicles and as more heat pumps come to the system, there's a little bit of headroom in there that allows that kind of additional electricity demand at peak times to be on the system. But when you've got the red dots, that means that really we can't really, that network is going to have to be reinforced fairly soon after adding those additional loads. Now, the whole point of flexibility really is about trying to kind of mitigate that reinforcement or defer it so that it gives us a better chance of actually delivering the infrastructure upgrades that we need to kind of cope with electrification. But if you look on the right hand side, this is kind of more the high voltage networks and spends area. So here you can see actually when you kind of get above the low voltage networks where they're combining into higher voltage networks, we've actually got not much kind of there's not much kind of spare room we have until we've got to reinforce a lot of networks in that area. So again, flexibility is really crucial in terms of helping us to kind of mitigate that kind of cost or defer that cost of reinforcement of those networks. So yeah, so now we've gone through different temporal scales and a bit of different spatial scales of flexibility. So now I want to emphasize a little bit about why our net zero system is going to be harder to balance than our systems today. And we've got nine reasons here. And this is starting to move on to, okay, these are all the challenges that we've got. And AI it could be applied to a lot of these challenges to help overcome them. So the first one is a big one. So more participants to manage and interact with. So when I mentioned before that at the moment we have around about 100 different actors or so, well, at least historically we've had about 100 or so different actors that we vary at the supply in response to demand, because our electricity networks have typically had quite a bit of headroom on them. Now in the future, we anticipate that we're going to move from hundreds to millions. So the kind of the prospect of potential every person in every car in the country is likely to be an electric vehicle. Lots of people are going to have heat pumps. There's going to be a lot of kind of batteries on the system, and each one of these is an actor against which we can vary the demand within the system. And so it's providing flexibility at those end points of use, as opposed to providing flexibility at the supply side. So that is a challenge in itself, because and then alongside that you've got more spatial variability in flex requirements and capacity. So we just went through it a little bit, but the actual amount of flex that you can provide is you have to understand where all those assets are and also where those varying demands are. And so whereas previously there's been a lot of national system services, there's going to be a lot more requirement for more spatially tailored services for flexibility and to be able to manage assets at a more fine spatial granularity. The next one is around there's going to be more technology types. So I mean, on the demand side at the moment, we you have combi boilers, you have old style boilers, but effectively there aren't that many different technology types that in your homes and your businesses. But as we get towards net zero, we are going to have loads of different technology types. There's loads of different everything from different chemistries of battery that provide different roles, all the way through to different types of heat pumps, low temperature and high temperature heat pumps, all the way through to different types of EVs, different types of, you've got solar panels on there, you've got all these different things that are integrated across the system in different ways. And there's many more technology types in terms of supply as well. And so there's a lot more variability in your characteristics of your supply and your demand than we currently have. Next up, we've got uncertainty. So as we mentioned, many of those assets that they're talking about kind of controlling as a demand side, they're going to be in people's homes, and there's going to be in people's businesses, and people don't always act as we expect or we want, and similarly, and so therefore you've got increasing amounts of uncertainty available with the amount of flexibility that you can provide. So understanding where that uncertainty comes from, which parts of the system that comes from, what are those things that we can kind of understand in more detail, that is going to be really critical to delivering the reliability that we need from flexibility in the future. Then one that I kind of alluded to before, but again is important, is that our supply side flexibility is going to go down. So decarbonate, kind of low carbon technologies are typically less easy to control in terms of flexing up and down as and when we need them. So nuclear, wind, solar, they're all basically less flexible. So in nuclear's case, it's more likely to be gas turbines, for example. Solar and wind, you can turn them off, you can curtail them, but it's essentially lowering their utilization rates. And we want to try and make kind of best use of every kind of electron that we can create, ideally. And so that those kind of non-flexible supply technologies are things that we've got to kind of counterbalance with a mixture of kind of managing our network reinforcement, but also kind of flexing your demands. And finally, a lot of electrification. So at the moment, our electricity networks, as I said, we've got kind of typically got kind of an okay amount of headroom, but we've got we're going to have EVs, we're going to have heat pumps, and even in those kind of 1 in 20 winters, where that's kind of in that beast from the east diagram, that gas demand associated with kind of heating generally in that beast from the east is going to be replaced by kind of by heating from electrification a lot of the time, alongside things like heat networks and things. And so we've got to account for that scale of demand change from heat pumps. And so the final three are more energy vectors and more integration. So at the moment we have electricity and gas. They interact in some ways, but they are largely operated independently of one another. And so we had electricity network companies, we have gas network companies, but in the future there's going to be a lot more intersections across these different vectors. But also we're going to add some vectors. So we're going to add heat networks. Some of these heat networks might be quite big. We're going to add hydrogen networks. Those hydrogen networks might go, they're likely to go to kind of industry and heavy duty vehicles and maybe shipping, maybe aviation, but they might even people's homes. And so there's going to be a lot of this kind of crossover between the operation of different energy vectors in order to provide that kind of balancing. And as I said before, kind of the storage of say gas or hydrogen or heat within kind of hot water is much more resilient to flexibility challenges than kind of the storage of electricity. And so then we're going to have more markets. And so, as I mentioned earlier, that kind of previously we've had a lot of kind of national system control, but now with that kind of spatial, the need for more spatial granularity, we're likely to have kind of both national. In fact, we already are seeing both national and local markets. But some of the challenges we have are that some of the services that a particular kind of flexibility provider wants to participate in are national, but also their local one, but they can't necessarily participate in kind of other local markets. So you've got this challenge of integrating those local and national markets together, but at the same time, those markets and how those markets are translated into kind of price signals that people respond to are actually affecting the kind of the load curve of demand that you see at the end. So unless you're careful, you can start seeing people all charging their electric vehicles at that one point where the price is lowest. And so your national signals can start affecting your local constraints. And so those things are quite difficult to kind of reconcile. And there's quite a bit of work going on at the moment, and the work that ESC are doing as well on that kind of side of things. And then the final challenge, which makes it hard to kind of decarbonize, but also just to kind of make the system flexible, is that change needs to happen quicker than ever before. This is a heroic challenge that we're facing across the whole system, and flexibility is one of those parts as well, in terms of transitioning from that fairly centralized system to a very decentralized system that needs to be controlled in many more ways. And so kind of the how quickly this needs to happen is really quite impressive. So last couple of slides of this section before we open up to a bit of Q&A. But if I was to kind of really be pushed to create two overarching challenges around flexibility, one is making sufficient flexibility available. So getting people to buy the stuff that is flexible, getting people to engage with flexibility on a reliable and ongoing basis. That's a big challenge in itself. And then when you have that flexibility on the system, how do you then make it work? How do you make sure that people and organizations across the complexity of the system how can they provide reliable responses in the right place and the right time? And so these are kind of broadly, and I'll come back to these a bit later, these are broadly kind of how I think about flexibility. And so just to give you a bit of an idea about, okay, kind of if I'm thinking about working in this space, then kind of is it going to be worth my time? Is it going to kind of translate into a really good idea? And the kind of the broad answer is yes. There's a lot of value in flexibility, and you can broadly cut this up into four tranches really. One is deferring or reducing distribution network reinforcement, and so just that bottom right box and the orange box there, kind of there's a study done for government recently that showed that just on low voltage networks and distribution networks, kind of that's got the possibility to save around £35 billion using behind the meter kind of flexibility. Deferring, reducing transmission network reinforcement. So that's kind of the much higher voltage stuff. And so I think there's kind of there's a lot of value there as well, and it's in the billions. Reducing capital and operational cost of generation. So this is very much saying, right, if you kind of provide kind of reliable flexibility, it means you don't have to build that extra kind of I don't know 10, 20 gigawatts of supply, generation supply. And so it's essentially the value of that flexibility is a mitigating of that investment, that capital investment into those plants, but also at the same time it's around the operation of those as well. Even though some of those plants are fairly low operational cost, they tend to, if they're low operational cost, they tend to be higher in terms of capital cost. And so flexibility is really trying to do that, but it can only really unlock that value if you do flexibility reliably. Now, the last one is a really important challenge, but I'd say it's not necessarily kind of directly represented in terms of value yet, which is, as I mentioned, this is a heroic challenge to deliver a net zero system, and kind of our supply chain in terms of actually delivering kind of bigger infrastructure and kind of at scale throughout the country is not infinite, and the kind of the rate of change that we need is already quite impressive, and so the value of flexibility is also to actually enable us to get to net zero. Providing flexibility allows us to manage our supply chains more efficiently, to allow us to reinforce networks where we need it most. So, but in terms of kind of the big figures, we're broadly talking kind of just at the moment, we already spend about 1.2 billion pounds per year, and it seems to be growing, on kind of in general, on balancing the system through the balancing mechanism. That's not all the balancing that we do, but it's a good chunk. But from kind of modelled studies, kind of study for carbon trust and study for government, and it's kind of broadly in line with the work that we do here at the Catapult, you're looking at kind of tens of billions of pounds per year from now to 2050 in terms of the value of that flexibility can provide. So this is a big kind of pot to aim for if that's the kind of the way that you think about it. So for the moment, I'll stop there and open up to questions and answers before we go on to a bit more about how AI can help.
Thank you, Alex. I'm just going to read out one of the questions. I've got one myself as well, and there's a couple in the chat. Timor asks if there's any difference in flexibility challenges, plans or structured between retail and corporate energy customers.
So I think you have different motivations, and so some corporate customers, so this is, I guess it's another kind of layer of complexity to it, because when we as an example of a corporate customer, if you have the need to decarbonize, but you have an electricity connection to your kind of site that's constrained, then the motivation is really you've got to kind of manage your kind of demands on site. And so therefore your need for flexibility happens within the boundaries of your site and tries to reduce the impact on your connection. So that's another kind of motivation. Whereas in retail, it's really about trying to kind of reflect the market signals of the systems, both at national and local level, to a variety of customers. And so kind of those kind of corporate organizations might also kind of bid into those, but they've also got their own challenges within their site. So I think it's another layer that those or kind of large customers would need to think about. And I've got a slide a little bit later on that kind of alludes to that as well.
Thanks. I just wanted maybe to, before I go on the other questions, maybe flesh out a bit about who the actors are who'd be shaping sort of the flexibility. You know, who'd be sort of implementing the energy management, as you see in these, and also controlling those markets as well.
So the key actors in terms of shaping. Sorry, you're saying in terms of shaping kind of what the demands are, or shaping?
Yeah, who will be implementing that flexibility essentially? Who are the core actors you see?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So essentially, you've got the way that I like to think about it is that you've got those that are responding to kind of you've got those kind of assets and those kind of end uses that are responding to signals. So these are the assets inside people's homes and kind of the batteries on the networks and things like that. And then what you'll probably have, and this is still evolving, is you probably have some sort of flexibility service provider. And so that could be your energy supplier, or it could be a third party. And their responsibility really is to kind of gain kind of almost kind of control over a range of assets, and to kind of have an aggregated kind of group of capacity that they can kind of reliably control. And they're the ones that essentially are interacting with markets, and those markets are both from distributed system operators. So these are kind of all the regional network operators that are trying to manage their own assets, and then there's the national markets from the kind of from kind of national system operators, or operators, and so those are the ones where they're kind of trying to balance the kind of national frequency levels. And so essentially you've got the market developers, you've got that kind of specifying the needs and trying to pass on signals, and then you've got the kind of responsible actors, which are kind of broadly a group of flexibility service providers, and then you've got the actors that are essentially the ones that need to sign up to be kind of controlled, if that makes sense.
Thank you. CDs asks, does it make sense to work on flexibility when the grid architecture needs significant revision first in order to be fit for purpose?
I think two things can be true at the same time, and I think that does allude to my comment before about the kind of almost the untapped value of flexibility being allowing us to create that kind of transitioned electricity system in particular at the same time, kind of in the most kind of effective way. So if from a kind of idealistic point of view, yes, we probably would benefit from like a wholesale big change to a lot of the distribution networks and a lot of the transmission networks. In reality, we can't deliver that at scale by 2050 using kind of the supply chains that we have available to us now, or even what we could probably grow in time to actually deliver meaningful impact. And so I think it's absolutely critical that we look at that from that side of things in terms of transitioning the infrastructure, but at the same time we need to be able to use flexibility to kind of to control that transition really, and to make sure that we do that transition most effectively, allowing us to electrify and decarbonize our demands at the same time as managing the infrastructure that's supplying it. otherwise, what would end up if you said that, right, we're not going to decarbonize and electrify kind of our demands until we get right near towards kind of 2050, it means you've got to have this heroic kind of deployment of assets during that time. So I think it's about having them both alongside each other and coordinating them across both sides of it.
I think Oliver agrees with you, saying they have to happen in parallel. Howard asked the question as, how do you see REMA changing the landscape? So that's if you want to spell out the acronym first, I can't remember it.
Yeah, yeah. So this is so essentially, there's a lot of work going on around reforming electricity markets at the moment, which is essentially recognizing that our current markets are not necessarily fit for purpose. So I do think that, I mean, without going to kind of all the details, there are things like how you kind of represent the volatility of electricity prices, so that you can have your flexibility assets that are kind of exposed to the full volatility, which is really where they get their value. Kind of you want to be able to kind of buy electricity when it's kind of low price, and you want to be able to sell it when it's high price. But at the same time, you've got various mechanisms that mean that those are kind of currently dampened, so that kind of your supplying technologies have confidence that they're going to get their return on investment. So there's kind of REMA kind of through that process, they are kind of addressing some of those characteristics about how you kind of provide that kind of volatility to storage operators. But in general, it's about trying to make those markets more effective at representing the physics of the system. And so I think as a rule, REMA is probably good for kind of flexibility providers, and it is likely to provide incentives to further develop our our ability to deliver flexibility.
Thank you. Jamie asks, what can distribution networks do more of to enable flexibility markets?
To enable flexibility markets. So I think one thing that distribution networks could do more of, and I think, and this is something that a lot of them are working on, but it's also quite a challenge, is understanding what their networks are really. And I think most distribution networks would accept that there's quite a bit of grey space where they don't fully understand exactly where what characteristics each of their kind of low voltage assets kind of looks like. And so I showed you some pictures earlier of from Spen, which is where they've got kind of low voltage monitoring across all of their substations. Now that allows you to have more kind of a better understanding about where to reinforce and where flexibility can have most impact. And so increasing that kind of that knowledge of where kind of what your capacity and different assets are is probably one of the most critical parts to actually allowing you to shape your markets. So you can develop your markets to reflect the needs of your particular network, and each of those networks are going to have different characteristics that they need. So I think there's probably and I think there is ongoing work across most of those networks in terms of saying, right, what's the balance between investing in kind of monitoring versus other kind of approaches to kind of that may be less expensive to implement, but give us most of the benefits of that monitoring. So I think that's one of the big things they can do.
Thank you. There's some questions about AI there. I'll leave those for the chat where Sam will answer those. We'll be talking a bit more about AI flexibility in a moment. So I'll just maybe take a couple more questions on the DSO, and then we'll move on to the next. Timur asks, for DSO flexibility, how do we standardize and centralize the markets? So that's a big question, but maybe some comments in that area.
How do we standardize? Sorry, how do you standardize and what? Sorry.
And centralize the markets. So, how do we sort of coordinate? I guess if we're moving to localized energy markets, and how do we make sure that there's interconnectivity between them? Might be one part of that question.
I think just to kind of I'd push back a little bit and say that it's not necessarily about centralizing. It's about enabling those markets to communicate with each other. And so you have the possibility of creating kind of markets all over the place. You have your national markets, and you can have your local markets in terms of those that your distribution system operator might run but you might also have little mini markets within kind of local clusters. And so the key thing is that you have kind of standard kind of data and standard kind of data transfers between those different parties that allows them to understand what the status of the other market is, and how do you, and also kind of agreeing. One of the kind of hot topics at the moment is around privacy rules, which is, okay, if one market's telling an asset to do something and the other market really wanted to do something else to control, to stop a kind of particular asset being kind of overloaded, then which one wins? And therefore, and so kind of those privacy rules across different market levels is really important. And then the other side is just kind of allowing those flexibility service providers to kind of easily kind of operate across different markets to provide different services and stack the revenues that they can get. So and so when we say stacking, it means that you might want to participate within the balancing mechanism at the same time as participating in kind of local network kind of markets. And so it's the ability to kind of create those regulatory rules that allow us to have confidence and flexibility whilst allowing flexibility providers to maximize their revenue. So there are a few things going on at the moment around this space. And so, for example, kind of at the Catapult, we're involved in a project that's looking to kind of design the kind of platform through which you can kind of operate within multiple markets, and also other kind of organizations out there like Pitclow are trying to have similar kind of outcomes. And so I'd really recommend looking into those. Standardize. I think there's a bigger picture here in terms of open data, and it's something that the Catapult's been leading on for a while. We kind of ran the task force on the energy data task force and the energy digitalization task force. A lot of that is based around open data in order to kind of allow, kind of help networks share data, allow different organizations to have access to data in order to help innovation. So I think that's also important when you're looking at standardizing and centralizing, well, if you want to centralize markets. But it's a big question, so I hope that was okay.
Thanks. I'll just do one more, and probably won't get to all of them, but we might try and answer them later if we've got time. At least we can always try and answer them later. Just one more I'll do is from Indranil, which asks about, do we have the right policies and regulations to encourage flexibility service providers to come forward, or there's a barrier to entry here?
So I think there's definitely barriers to entry still. I think I mean some of that is around the kind of the ease of accessing different markets. We are seeing more and more flexibility service providers kind of come on board, but there are plenty of barriers to entry that we will be looking to address over time. And so REMA might address some of those, but some of those around kind of interoperability of different technologies and things like that as well. And so yeah, there's a lot of barriers. I was probably not the right place to go into all of those, but just to kind of give a little bit of a plug on the wider flexibility space. One of the things we're developing at the moment is a report on enabling flexibility for net zero, which will come out in April time, which will identify some of those barriers that we're facing at the moment in terms of kind of enabling kind of service providers to provide flexibility.
Brilliant, thanks. We'll try and answer some in the chat while Alex goes on to the next session as well. So yeah, if you do want to start on your next, thanks for everyone for their questions. Unfortunately, we can't get to them right now.
Yeah, thank you very much. And so I'll just crack on. So the next part of this is, right, okay, how can AI help? And also we'll cover a bit of a deep dive into one particular example. So broadly, AI can help in a lot of places. So I've split these down into those two kind of broad categories: making flexibility available and making it work. And so if we look at that left-hand side first, smart building control. Now, smart buildings, one, is a bit of a kind of a term that's maybe kind of been watered down a little bit as we go on. But I think generally what it's really saying is that we're making we're developing capacity from things that didn't used to have capacity. to provide flexibility. So it's like, okay, how do you kind of enable these previously unused things to be used through kind of smart technology? Understanding consumers to develop propositions that lead to the uptake of flexible technologies and services. Now, for me, this is a really big one. This is kind of, and something that the energy sector historically has not been that great at. This is about saying, right, if we're not seeing the uptake of low carbon technologies and flexibility that we need in order to provide the services that we need, then how do we understand what people value? How do we understand kind of what people will buy into in order to make this stuff available? And for me, a lot of that is understanding the detail of consumers. And so we're not talking about lumping people into one of 8 categories. It's saying, like, almost on a person by person basis, what do they value, and how do we actually kind of make best use of the different types of people and the different types of motivations and values that exist out there in order to provide this flexible energy system. Coordinated community control. So I alluded to a little bit before in terms of those kind of almost those micro markets, but just kind of as you've probably seen a bit at the moment, you have community projects, you have community wind farms, you have community kind of even things outside of energy, you have community control or community projects, and community control flexibilities is no different, because at the end of the day, if there are potential benefits for local communities if you can bring those assets together to operate as a single entity. These benefits could be financial, it could be other things. And both smart buildings and that side of things, I'll go in a little bit more detail later. So in terms of making it work, so forecasting weather and underlying demand for services is a big one. I mean, at the end of the day, kind of how we procure ahead of time the supply kind of that for energy is largely based on your kind of estimation of demand, right? And estimation of demand is largely based upon your weather forecasting. And so increasing your accuracy of weather forecasting, both your accuracy but also your kind of how far ahead you can see it, is really important for supporting flexibility. It's essentially, to some extent, it's minimizing waste, I guess, in terms of flexibility. It's making those markets more efficient by making sure you're only procuring the flexibility that you know that you're going to need. So the more errors you have in your forecasting, the more things you've got to pay to provide flexibility backup, which you want to try and avoid if you can. We'll never get rid of all of it, but that's kind of what we're trying to do. So as I mentioned, kind of if you look across there, forecasting available renewable energy is largely based on your weather forecasts, and then it's about optimizing, kind of looking at the optimal power flow across the system. So there are various different constraints on networks, kind of electricity networks, and you've got various different generation assets in different parts of the country, and if you are able to kind of forecast that renewable energy provision, forecast your flexibility provision in your storage provision throughout the country, you're able to most effectively manage which assets are generating, which ones are storing, in order to manage the power flow across your electricity networks. And it becomes an increasingly complex thing to do as we get more of those assets on the system and the more kind of intermittency of generation across those kind of low carbon technologies. So again, almost on the kind of two sides of the same coins, forecasting the flexibility available to the system, but this is probably a little bit more a few more kind of variables added to this in terms of what I mentioned before about some of these kind of flexibility assets are going to be at the behest of potentially irrational behaviour, but also you need to understand not just kind of how much kind of capacity of a storage you have, but it's also what state of charge is it at. Like if you've got a 500 megawatt battery, but it's only got kind of 10% of its charging, you're not going to be able to get the full kind of service you need if you want it to push out some of that electricity into the system, for example. So you want to be able to forecast or at least be told what the status of those technologies are. Procuring flexibility from a range of actors. So this comes into this kind of markets, and it comes into this question about how do you how do you procure most effectively? Do you procure it do you want to know every single piece of information about every one of those actors, or do you do it more probabilistically? Decentralized market delivery. So again, this is a case of how do you work across those different markets in terms of how do you kind of integrate those together with kind of decentralized markets, your centralized markets, how do you make them work together? Optimal trading for storage. So I guess this is a different lens on it. It's saying, okay, as a storage operator, I want to create a kind of maximize my revenue. And so how do I trade it most effectively? And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. Smart electric vehicle and home system management. So this is kind of relating a bit to kind of smart building control, but it's kind of focused on particularly your electric vehicles and your home system management. But again, this is the lens of, okay, I'm operating a building. How do I maximize the value to the well, either to the occupant or to the kind of flexibility service provider that's providing that flexibility. And then energy network management, leaving kind of fairly big one till last, but essentially it's saying, right, you've got all, I talked before about all those different kind of complexities across time and space in terms of managing your energy networks. How do you most effectively manage those energy networks in the future system? So these are all areas that I think AI can contribute in various ways. And so just to kind of take on a bit of a case study, imagine this is a situation really. There's increased energy renewables on the network, and these are intermittent and depending on weather conditions. And then energy storage is one way to help kind of maximize the utilization of that renewable energy, and use when demand is highest, but wind and solar generation is lowest. And so energy storage can be utilized for balancing services, but also a simple application involves charging and discharging at appropriate times to either maximize renewable energy utilization or maximize revenue, depending on what you're using that kind of particular storage asset for. So you could try to optimize the battery in real time, but this might produce suboptimal results since the battery may not have sufficient charge to react to network conditions, as I kind of alluded to on the last slide. And so the battery operation should be planned to anticipate key time points and allow an optimal schedule, which can utilize the appropriate time. We can utilize at the appropriate time. And so this is where AI and machine learning can come in. So can you use AI and machine learning to provide data-driven approach that you understand your historical demands, you understand the generation and price data to help support decision making for those battery storage devices, and but also you understand those kind of the markets that you're operating within. So you can optimize to, as I said, you can optimize to maximize renewable energy generation, or you can optimize to maximize the costs from within various kind of energy markets. You also need to know kind of what your competitors are doing in those times, and so there's lots of companies that are involved in this space already. So this is quite a kind of a thriving space that exists. And so, but broadly, you can categorize those different organizations into different kind of work into different kind of parts of this. And so if you wanted a couple of examples of companies that are working here, you can look at Arenco or Modo Energy. And in the latter case, a lot of what Modo Energy have been good at is really kind of providing the information that allows kind of storage operators and to actually kind of maximize their optimization of their kind of trading of their assets. So, but broadly, you can split into three parts. So, understanding the patterns and relations between historical data. So it's trying to identify what the main features and drivers to kind of the kind of future needs that are likely to happen in the system. So then it's going to move into the forecast model. So you're then saying, okay, what are you likely to need in the next time period? And so kind of broadly, you want to understand kind of how you're going to kind of make best use of the charge on your current battery. Do you do it in the next hour, or is it more likely that you're going to get better kind of bang for your buck if you do it in 2 or 3 hours time? So this could include probabilistic models. which can also estimate the uncertainty of the data and therefore help understand the risk, understand the range of likely possible outcomes, and the confidence in the outputs and the risks. So I think this is something that we kind of I think we're kind of fast learning this as part of the energy sector in terms of that kind of that confidence rating to different kind of decisions that need to happen. And then there's the optimization method. So to create the optimal schedule also requires finding the optimal state from a very complex and often large objective function. So the data which is used is stochastic, as complex nonlinear relationships, and there are kind of in mathematical parlance, it is a constraining optimization under uncertainty. So finally, a battery can be used to also model other components in line kind of that you can kind of flex within the system as well. That they don't just have to be batteries. And finally, AI and machine learning can also be used to model the degradation of batteries. And so in terms of getting the most out of kind of an asset, you want to understand like how much can I make from it, how much use can I get from it in kind of over its lifetime, but also kind of because of the kind of the chemistry of batteries, of different types of batteries that exist out there, the way you cycle them, how deep you discharge them, kind of how many cycles a day, how many cycles a year you use them for, can affect their lifetime. So you've also got to kind of create ways to understand how your operation of a particular asset is going to affect its long-term kind of technical life, and that will have a kind of a factor to play in how you actually then utilize it. So these are also things that you can use AI and machine learning for. So just to put it in a bit more kind of a bit more tangible example, imagine a battery placed within a distribution network. So with hundreds of downstream domestic properties and a few small non-domestic buildings, say, there's headroom capacity on the downstream network, so kind of going towards the loads and the buildings, but the upstream network has insufficient capacity to meet the full demand. So the aim here is to charge the battery when demand is low, reducing overall demand on the network to within safe limits. So we need to know when demand will be low, and when demand will be high, which is a function of many factors that we've talked about so far. And so we also need to make sure that we charge the storage at a point low enough so as to not create a new peak. And so this is important because you've got to, if you charge at the wrong time, you might end up, if everyone does the same thing, you might end up developing a peak in a different point of the day that responds to markets but still exceeds that network limit, which is something that we need to avoid as well. And this kind of example is broadly applicable to lots of different situations. So when I was talking about kind of commercial kind of loads earlier, you could also imagine this situation being the case. That capacity limit could be the capacity limit on a connection to a particular site. And so there have been kind of examples that we've worked on where a particular site has been asked to pay, if they exceed their electricity network connection, they've been asked to pay tens of millions of pounds in order to upgrade it before they can kind of decarbonise anymore. So therefore, they want to utilise storage assets on their site in order to kind of avoid that that payment. Now, for those of you that know your kind of electricity capacity kind of charging mechanisms, you'll probably know that you might not need to pay for that connection charge anymore some of the times, but in the near future. But still, the waiting times between now and actually being able to kind of get that connection upgraded, they're quite long, and so you'll still have the motivation to keep within your kind of capacity limit in order to allow your decarbonisation within the timescales you need. And so this is a more kind of detailed example again, and so I'll credit here to my co-presenter Stephen. He's one of the authors of this paper alongside potentially a couple of the people on this call. But this is an example of where what we're looking at here is a chart that shows the ability for battery storage technologies to impact upon the peak demands under different operating models. So the grey here is the actual demand on a low voltage feeder. The blue is the forecast demand, and the red line shows a storage asset, which looks something similar to one on the right. It's not actually the one they use, but it looks like the one on the right. So the red line shows a storage asset that is responding to a real-time information of actual demands. And the yellow line is showing what would happen if you had perfect foresight. So what you see is that without foresight, kind of the battery can shave like about 11% off peak demand on the network from that feeder. But with foresight, you can shave about 17% off the peak, which is a significant difference. But the other thing you can see is that kind of in that first peak that you see around about kind of 6 o'clock, kind of is fairly kind of the red line is fairly able to respond to that kind of peak. But in that second peak, you're really you're really struggling. And so it's kind of it's showing without knowing what's happening in the future, you're not able to optimize what you do now. And so that was just a bit of an example of how, and from my point of view, AI and machine learning is about trying to get towards that kind of perfect foresight model. It's kind of right. How close to that can we get, and that therefore how much improvement can we make? And those little kind of margins can make all the difference to those kind of organizations that are really trying to trade different assets. But then just to kind of bring it back to kind of saying, oh, but it's not that easy, is kind of demand is hard to predict and quickly changing, because some of those homes on that kind of low voltage feeder might have electric vehicles with a time of use tariff from their supplier that tries to charge their vehicle at times with low electricity charges. And some of those homes might have an electric vehicle and a battery, and a time of use tariff from a different energy supplier. Some of those homes might have a heat pump and solar PV as well, with a time of use tariff, but working with a third-party flex provider to maximise the integration across their assets, a different one to those used by the companies, by the properties, sorry. And I know you might even have some of those homes might decide to optimise for carbon as opposed to cost, and so then there might be some local generation as well, potential with contractual agreements with some of the homes and businesses in the area. And so you, with your battery, still want to maximise the effectiveness of your battery to maximise your revenue whilst avoiding those network constraints, accounting for all of that variability downstream of your asset. And so I feel like there's been a lot of kind of in this presentation so far, a lot of saying this is a really complex area, which I imagine that a lot of you on the call will be quite happy with and be quite comfortable with. But just to say that there's also kind of many potential kind of data sources that can be used to kind of now as well, and this is increasing all the time, and something that the Catapult are kind of really trying to kind of push for. So network data, kind of data presumed open, is where network operators are increasingly sharing their data on their hubs. So there's GIS data, there's network topology data, telemetry data, curtailment data, capacity data, innovation trial data, all that is available to use to help you kind of get into this space. Market data is also quite widely available. You've got the electron balancing mechanism kind of reporting service, and you've got EPEX Spot and N2EX, and then you've got weather data. So this is, you can either pay for this or you can get limited access, depending on kind of what you're doing. But and that's forecast, but then observations and reanalysis. So smart meters are kind of, you'll be aware of them, but smart meter data is potentially quite useful, but it's still relatively limited in terms of your access to it. But some data sets can be accessed for researchers. And then we've got our data as well. So we have a platform called USmart, where we make data available. And we have a living lab, for example, of kind of just over a couple of thousand homes now. We have access to their data, and we run trials from those homes, and we test consumer propositions on those homes. And some of our data is available online as well. So I'll pause there for the next set of questions and answers.
Yeah, we're so we've a little short on time, so I might just answer one question quickly that's in the chat, and then maybe move on to the sector. My colleague Sam has already answered some of this question anyway, but Freya asks about AI can be susceptible to inaccuracies and data hallucinations in the context of predictive AI and increased climate volatility, how we can mitigate against the impacts of these hallucinations to refine our forecasting abilities. It's a good question. It's something that needs to be looked at in more detail as well. And I think we don't necessarily have the right instruments yet to understand, how much these systems could cascade through the energy sector system. There's a little bit of a look at this with sort of how we could govern algorithms and at least understand what's connected to what. And I'll put a link in the chat there shortly. About hallucinations, that's typically been associated to large language models, but there's quite a few sort of generative AI algorithms now being considered for time series and other things which are relevant. In fact, we've got a talk on Wednesday, which I'll share the link to, which is looking at sort of generative AI for energy systems. So that might be of interest. But just to briefly say, I think there's going to be a balance of what we have to try and regulate, what contingencies we might have to put in as well, and also try and understand, where do we sort of allow automation on the system and where do we have to sort of put in a lot of safeguards on the system. And, we don't want to be too tight on either side of that because we either lose the automation completely or the benefits of it, or on the other side, we add a lot of risks to the system. So hopefully that's answered some of that questions, and I'll add a few links. So yeah, Alex, yeah, just please continue, and then hopefully we've had a bit of time in the end of that one for questions.
Okay, great, thank you. And so on this next section, I'm going to go over a few areas. So we that battery trading optimization one is something that's there's a lot happening already on it, but these next sections are ones that are maybe a little bit more emerging. And so I'm going to talk about a little bit across different scales, right? So buildings, local areas, and national. So I'm going to talk a bit more about smart homes and smart buildings, smart local energy systems, but also opportunities within the system operator as well. And so when we kind of talk about smart buildings, this is kind of, as I said before, sitting under the category of making sufficient flexibility available. So and today, electricity and gas is metered, and we generally are responsible for kind of ourselves kind of choosing what our set points are, making our homes and our buildings as warm and effective as possible. And so we tailor that, and we have kind of apps on your phone that you can kind of set your schedules and things like that. But generally, we pay for your kilowatt hours and your therms of energy. In the future, and something that this is something that Catapult kind of has done a lot of work on, is that electricity and gas will still be metered, but will more likely to be billed for services. And so third parties would be responsible for delivering those services, and they have control over the over assets within homes. So this is a case of, you pay for transport, for example. So the third party is making sure that you can always get the kind of transport that you need from your electric vehicle when you need it. But at the same time, when you're not using it, that they can make use of that asset in order to provide value to you and provide value to the system. Similarly, you can do the same. You potentially do the same with warmth. So you're making sure that your home is warm when you need it, that you're kind of that you feel warm, which is a complex structure in itself. But also you can provide flexibility across the assets within your home in order to make sure that when those assets are kind of underutilized, you can make use of them and provide value to yourself and to the system. So this approach, there's more benefits than just this. Is kind of generally associated with a movement of risk away from risk-averse consumers and towards organisations whose business models revolve around understanding that risk. It might even transfer some capital expenditures away from consumers to third parties. So that, just an example, you see some companies who give you solar panels for free if they can use your roof, but kind of imagine that, but extrapolating that to kind of bigger things and bigger kind of more holistic services. So it kind of that kind of process can accelerate the uptake of low carbon technologies, but also in terms of making those making sufficient flexibility available, and what kind of system operators called like liquidity when it comes to flexibility. It's about kind of that service-based proposition can enable that to happen. And so, but as a service kind of propositions can support flexibility realization. So it's about making that redundant flexibility within buildings available. But in order to do that, you need to start to understand what the outcomes are that people want. So this kind of movement to responsibility away from individuals to third parties means that you've got to really start understanding what consumers value a bit more, and how you can. So if you know their outcomes, you can optimize flexibility against a constraint of the desired outcome, or ideally exceeding those outcomes. So, however, you need to be able to measure your outcomes against those desired, as well as measuring the benchmark position. So there's another question about how do you how do you kind of prove that what you've done was different to what would have happened anyway. And this applies to domestic and non-domestic buildings. So each has their own challenges. For example, non-domestic buildings, they do have existing building management system providers, and they have the potential to kit buildings out with the sensors, but you're trying to satisfy a larger number of people and a much broader range of services in general than that you do in a domestic property. So building owners are used to minimizing cost, and the benchmark for average building performance is a relatively low bar, quite frankly. And so, but on the other side, domestic customers have direct responsibility for buying services and will be able to switch if their perception is that the services are not meeting their desired outcomes. So, which may or may not be rational. So it is absolutely critical that each person has warmth and transport available to them when they need it. And so, just to kind of further exemplify where this is going, recently there's been kind of growing support for smart building ratings, and so which provides benchmarks for kind of smart performance of different buildings. And so, kind of late last year, ESC, along with the Centre for Net Zero, and supported by a whole range of other people in the system, called for the establishment of a smart building rating alongside an EPC and an energy performance certificate to be consulted upon. And this is supported by. So what this essentially do is quantify how much how suitable your home is to provide flexibility, or your building, and therefore kind of how kind of suitable is to kind of creating additional value for people, and to kind of accelerate the uptake of smart solutions. Smart local energy systems. So these are kind of smart local energy systems are kind of essentially collections of assets, so they're community-led groups of energy assets as part of a local system that maximizes the outcomes for those that own the assets together. And so there are a multitude of different kind of business models for smart local energy systems, all designed to meet slightly different objectives. They often make best use of playing within existing market structures, so kind of maximizing the kind of benefits provided to people in the local area was also, and a lot of the time it's in terms of revenue that's then shared amongst those kind of those owners, but also they're often kind of looking at carbon as well as in terms of one of their objective functions. And so I guess the way they're slightly kind of ambiguous to how they're defined. I don't think you'll find a specific definition for smart local energy systems, but generally that you're looking at kind of this bottom-up approach to kind of creating smart control, as opposed to this top-down price signal approach. And so if you wanted to look at our website for a few different kind of ideas of what those business models are, they include local flexibility markets driven by a single buyer within an area. Local energy markets aim to utilize local generation locally, optimizing local generation and demand in constrained areas to allow new connections to happen. And new connections means new homes or new businesses, and that's kind of valuable to particular areas. And then you've got anchor assets and kind of within particular areas too. So outcomes that local stakeholders might want are maximizing revenue, delivering net zero equitably, driving growth in the local economy, delivering net zero faster than national kind of progress allows you to do, increasing local energy security, and delivering local health benefits, so minimizing pollution, things like that, minimizing illness. And so these are all kind of, it's almost, these kind of schemes are kind of, I wouldn't say they're common, but there seems to be an opportunity emerging for them. There's not loads of work done on this at the moment. There's a lot of academic work done. There's a few small trials done. We did quite a big program called Prospering from the Energy Revolution, which focused on smart local energy systems that you can look into too. But there's also various community-based trials that are going on, including Northern Power Grid's kind of community DSO kind of projects, where they're looking at kind of really kind of isolating nodes of their network in order to operate in this kind of way. And then going up to the national level, so this is kind of if you're not on top of the kind of the news, there's we're moving from what we used to be called the National Grid Electricity System Operator, which largely focused on the operation of electricity networks, of the electricity system, sorry, to what we were calling the Future System Operator. But as of the kind of last week, this new organisation will now be known as the National Energy System Operator, NESO. And NESO is basically there to ensure that the future energy system minimises system costs whilst maximising security of supply and safety and meeting net zero. So they've got this big challenge on their hands, and they are they're very important in terms of our delivery. They're also expanding their remit from electricity only really to kind of certainly gas, but also meant to be taking a much more whole systems approach across different energy vectors. And so they're the ones that are going to be spending money on balancing effectively, and they are no longer going to be a kind of a private body. They're almost like they're an arm's length kind of organisation from governments, and so they're largely meant to be independent. And so, but they, as part of their control room, so their room, essentially that room where people essentially saying kind of making trades and asking people to deliver kind of energy when they need it. And I think the classic example is when they know that kind of a big program's about to finish, and everyone puts something on their kettle. They need to be able to see that happening so that they know what to procure. But that's going to become much more complicated, and so that challenge from moving from hundreds to millions of actors is largely a challenge that kind of NESO is going to be facing. And so they've recognised that artificial intelligence is likely to have a role within their kind of control centre, and they've set up this energy AI centre of excellence, which is opportunities to work within. And so areas that are of interest might include cascade effects of energy system dynamics in response to market design, probabilistic approaches to reliably estimating demand response to a given signal, approaches to coordinating across different spatial scales, and further improvements to forecasting distributed solar resource across the country. These are just examples, but there's going to be a whole range of different applications of AI that are likely to be kind of benefit to NESO and others. So I'm not going to pretend to know too much about all of these, but kind of some of the techniques that are kind of talked about within the space within the energy sector include all of these that you see on the screen. So yeah, everything from linear regression through to kind of everything across forecasting, optimization, and control. And so these are some of the methods that you might want to kind of explore as part of your journey into applying AI into the energy system. Now, Stephen, shall I hand over back to you on this one?
Yeah, I think maybe there is, if you can answer a question, I think, which is related to you in the chat, that would be great. We're kind of running out of time, unfortunately, but we'll endeavour to answer everyone after this. And if you've got a burning question, then definitely get in contact with us. I'll put some details in shortly. Yeah, if you can move to the next slide. So as I say, this is part of the advice program. So we're really keen if people really want to get involved in this. And we've got sort of 3 core areas at the moment, which you could sort of get involved in. The first, as you see on the bottom, we've got the website there, so definitely visit that. You can find all our reports, and we'll have webinars and a knowledge hub up there soon. One of the core ways that we're hoping practitioners can get involved is through our data science sharing circles, so we think this is a kind of very unique way of sort of getting people from cross sectors, data scientists who actually do it in their day-to-day business, getting them together so they can talk to each other and share information they have about data sources, about tools that they're using, or maybe about different platforms, or you just meeting others and understanding sort of, areas of interest. So definitely get in contact if you're interested in that area. We've got some industry working groups as well. So that will be looking at some of these grand challenges and sort of ways we can look at sort of some of the systemic blockers, which might be making it difficult for us to solve them, and it could go from everything from the technical challenge down to sort of the sort of regulatory or governance issues. And then finally, we've got these webinars, this is the first of the series. There'll be webinars throughout the year. I hope you can get involved in those. We're also going to have a knowledge hub, which we hope to be quite active with the community involved in it, and where everyone can help each other out, sharing information, maybe connecting people together and identifying resources. Next slide, please. I just really want to quickly go over this last slide. This was linked to some data science challenges we ran in the last few years with a national grid electricity distribution, formerly Western Power Distribution. I only wanted to highlight this because if you've not been involved in energy projects before, this might be a really great place to start, because what it does is it provides a very well-defined challenge. It provides some data, and it also provides sort of some functions which can help you sort of compare yourself to others and benchmark. So I think my colleague will share the links to the Coda Lab pages which host those challenges, which are finished now, obviously, but you can still get involved, and the webinars which sort of kicked off and wrapped up those events as well. So if you go to the last slide, so I'm just going to thank you all for coming and attending, and certainly to Alex, who's given us a wonderful talk, and to everyone in the chat. It's been exceptionally active chat area, and it's a shame we couldn't get to everyone live. But please do get in contact with us if you're interested in getting involved. There's 3 QR codes which you can use to sort of either look into how to get involved in the advice program. There's also the email address at the bottom. And then there's the 2 reports that we've just launched a month ago, which are the ecosystem report. So please look over that, and the data science challenges for decarbonisation ones as well. In addition to that, please get in contact with myself or with Alex. We're happy to answer any of the questions you have in this area. But obviously, if you have any other things you want to talk to us about, then also get involved. And we're happy to either look at ways we can collaborate together or connect you to the right people. So yes, so I just want to say thank you again. Thank you to Alex, and we'll be sharing this shortly in our email for everyone who registered, and also on our YouTube. So thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.